For as long as I can remember, my father has always made it clear, with his attitude and his silence, that I was a tolerated presence, a shadow necessary to keep up appearances, and not a beloved daughter. And perhaps that's why, when he looked me in the eye that night and said, with a cruel naturalness, that I would marry Mateo Ruiz to save the skin of his adored stepdaughter Carmen, something inside me didn't break, but finally woke up, because I had stopped dreaming of recognition, affection, or any crumb of attention coming from that man. And for a long time, I had been feeding on a silent anger, fermented over the years when I was treated like a nuisance, like the inconvenient legacy of a love he pretended to live with my mother, the woman he slowly destroyed until all that was left was her body fallen from the 10th floor, a body they called suicide, but which I, even as a child, knew was a direct consequence of the poison he poured into every gesture, every betrayal, every lie. And that's why I accepted the marriage with a discreet smile, and not out of submission or fear, but because I saw it as a chance to enter through the front gate into the castle that had been taken from me, and recover, piece by piece, everything that my mother had built and that he had stolen, using his own daughter as a springboard for the sordid plans he had been plotting since before he signed the marriage certificate, because Fernando Morales was never an ordinary man. He was an architect of farces, an ambitious man blinded by power, who only knew how to get close to my mother when he saw the Sanchez fortune, and realized that he could climb to the top with her surname attached to his. And even after so much proof of his rottenness, it was she who financed his first business venture, who convinced his parents to accept him, who supported him emotionally and financially while he secretly lay with the woman who would become my stepmother, an accomplice in everything, including the camouflaged murder that ended my mother's life. And when her body hadn't even cooled down, he brought his mistress and her daughter into the house that should have been my safe home, renaming every room with false smiles and promises of new beginnings, and relegating me to the role of an extra in a story that should have been mine. And it was there, among the corridors of our old house, as I watched my new sister wear my clothes, my toys, and even the necklaces that my mother loved so much, that I learned to hide my pain, to mask my anger with a forced calm, to pretend that I didn't care, because I knew that one day it would end. And that day began when my father, with the company sinking into debt, decided to resurrect an old agreement between the Sanchez and the Ruiz, promising Carmen to marry the heir to a billionaire empire. But she, the little darling, refused with tears, scandals, and threats, and he, unable to contradict her, turned to me as if I were an old shoe, saying that now it was my turn to be good for something. And I, who had always waited for this moment, accepted without hesitation, because behind the appearance of a disposable woman, I carried the blood of the family he destroyed, the memory of the mother he murdered, and the name that still lived in the silent records of the company he had taken over as his own. And when I married Mateo Ruiz, the man who everyone said was in a wheelchair, reserved, strange, inaccessible, something told me that there was more there than the media showed. And I wasn't surprised when, on our wedding night, he got out of bed with the firmness of someone who always knows where he's going, walked to the bathroom with lethal elegance and looked over his shoulder at me, saying he didn't need any help. And it was at that moment that I understood that he, like me, was also playing a silent game, and that behind that disguise of vulnerability, there was someone who saw far beyond the surface. And over the next few days, between subtle conversations and silent dinners, he began to show me fragments of his story, revealing that his supposed disability was a strategy to keep the parasites out of his life, to identify who saw him as a man and who saw him as an obstacle, and that when he accepted me as his wife, he didn't do it out of pity or obligation, but because he saw in me something that he himself carried, contained hatred, a thirst for justice, and a strategic patience. And so he took me to his private library, where he kept confidential documents, incontrovertible proof that my father had embezzled money from my mother's companies for years. And more than that, proof that her suicide had been staged, with forged reports, altered examinations, bribes paid to doctors and police officers so that the case would be buried without investigation. And every page I read was like a punch, like an open wound bleeding again, until I cried, not from sadness, but from relief, at finally having in my hands what I needed to bring each of them down. And with Mateo by my side, we put together a meticulous plan, starting by infiltrating suspicions into the Morales company, planting small truths that, over time, would grow like poisoned roots, undermining the trust of the partners, eroding internal alliances, and meanwhile, Carmen continued to live in the artificial paradise my father had built for her, parading at parties, smiling at interviews, without imagining that the ground beneath her feet was about to collapse. And when the first scandals came to light, with allegations of tax fraud, currency evasion, and irregular contracts, my father tried to react with threats, tried to silence me with promises and blackmail. But it was too late, because public opinion turned, the investors backed down, and he went to our house in desperation, demanding explanations, trying to use the same posture as always, as the master of the world. But when he saw Mateo standing, without a chair, with documents in hand, he realized that he had been deceived. And when he saw my firm posture, he realized that he had lost control. So he ran back to the company, trying to destroy what was left. But the pressure knocked him down, and he was found unconscious, surrounded by burning papers, rushed to hospital, where he was in a coma, with the diagnosis that, even if he woke up, he would never be the same again. Meanwhile, my stepmother was intercepted at the airport with suitcases of money and false documents, and Carmen, on seeing her mother's arrest, collapsed, looking for me, begging for answers, and I, with the serenity of someone who has won, handed her the same folder I had seen years before, with photos, statements, and proof of her mother's involvement in my mother's death. And as I watched her world fall apart, I realized that that was the end of the old story and the beginning of mine. And when I took over the company, renaming it with my mother's surname, exonerating every accomplice, returning the embezzled sums, restoring the dignity of the brand he had destroyed, I felt whole for the first time. And when I visited my mother's grave with Mateo by my side, I laid fresh flowers and said, with a choked voice, "I've come back, Mom," and none of it was in vain. And as the wind blew across the cemetery garden, I saw the shadow of the past fade into the distance, taking with it the last vestiges of pain, because at that moment, I was no longer the forgotten girl. I was the heir, the guardian of the truth, and the woman who rebuilt with her own hands what they had tried to erase forever.